My name is Kristen Hovet, and welcome to the Other Autism podcast. I'm a research communications professional, and I have a master's degree in health studies. I was diagnosed with level 1 autism in my 30s, and I also live with health conditions that are often co-occurring alongside autism. The Other Autism is a place to explore late diagnosed autism, discuss the latest in autism research, and hear directly from autism researchers, help dispel myths and stereotypes about autism and autistic people, and more. If you're autistic or wondering if you might be, I'm hoping this podcast helps you to feel more informed and less alone. Today, I'm speaking with Cat, a late identified autistic individual from Australia. Before we get started, a warning that this episode gets a little bit heavy right out of the gate. We discuss medical trauma, cancer, infertility, IVF, stillbirth, and some toxic relationship dynamics. So please take care. Please say hello to my guest for today, Cat.
My name's Cat. I live in Melbourne, and I kind of live between Melbourne and the country. And I have a beagle, and I've recently become semi-retired. I left my occupation in allied health, which I'd been in for about 30 years, after realising that just really wasn't the right job for me, which I knew all along, but it's just really difficult to change occupations once you're in an occupation. And then COVID came along and we just were able to make the choices that we wanted to make to get out of that profession. So I've dealt with a lot of people, and it's had kind of a physical impact on me over time, where I probably should have been in a job where I wasn't dealing with so many people, just because of, recent realizations about, likely kind of autism 1 diagnosis, which I became more aware of after a personal crisis. I love music. I love good comedies, good shows, netball. I'm learning to draw. I love baking bread. Yeah, just have lots of diverse interests. But sometimes I get into an interest like watching Bake Off, and it's intense.
When you emailed me initially, so I'm just going to jump right into this question. You said that you resonated with my own story of being diagnosed following a life crisis. In my case, it was cancer and all the fallout after that. And one of the effects for me was that I was suddenly unable to mask in certain situations. It was like the cancer itself and all the treatments just exhausted my mind and body to the point where I just couldn't do it, even if I wanted to. Eventually, I was able to again, but it was definitely an interesting experience. I remember being frustrated with myself so much of the time. Of course, I didn't know that term masking then, and I didn't know I was autistic then, so I only have this awareness in retrospect. Are you comfortable talking about the lead up to your own identification of yourself as autistic and how this relates to masking?
Working with people, I think you tend to mask a lot, but you think, okay, you're doing your job, right? When I was 35, I'd been trying to conceive for about 2 years with that current partner, and discovered that in a 4-hour surgery that I had only half uterus and was basically had no functioning ovary. And so it meant that I had to do IVF. And I, at the time, left my partner, met a new amazing partner, and I was really lucky to meet him, and we just plummeted into love and had a really amazing beginning to our relationship, and it's continued for 16 years now, which is amazing. So I was really lucky there. However, we did IVF and had a failed cycle, and then we did a so-called successful cycle where we got pregnant. And I had a really, really nervous pregnancy. I felt really different to everybody, and everybody I knew was pregnant. Everybody I knew was fertile. They got pregnant. All of my friends were pregnant at that time. They all have 15-year-old children now, and I got to 35 weeks. And her heart stopped. Now, when I'd been counting all the statistics, right? I was really, really, careful. I thought, okay, I've got a half uterus. I'll treat it as a twin birth. I was saying I'm high risk to doctors. And I think I was treated as medium risk or, normal. And so when her heart stopped, we went to the hospital and, I didn't know it had stopped. I just couldn't feel her movement. We went in there and the nurse couldn't find the heartbeat. And then the doctor came in, checked again and just swung it around and said, oh, the heart's open. You can see the 4 chambers are open. And we were like, what? And it was just such a shock. And at the time, I just remember making these noises like a hurt animal. And it was just so shocking. So then I had the following day where we gave birth to my baby, a whole day, and then 2-hour surgery afterwards to remove the placenta, all these very complicated, awful things. And then we spent 2 days with my baby, which was just lovely that we got to spend that time with her. She was a 2-kilogram baby, beautiful, blue eyes, black hair. And so after that, we got out of hospital and we just thought everything was grief, just normal standard grief. And that I couldn't emote. I couldn't perceive safety in anyone. I only wanted to hug my partner and one of my brothers. And I just started losing that ability to speak to people. I didn't want to be around people. I had no prosody. I stopped being able to swallow properly, like just my whole body shut down. And these things, I was just thinking, okay, this is normal because we were concurrently directly afterwards doing IVF. So I'd spent the next year, we were doing IVF. We were traveling between Victoria and Perth, which is a really long way because we had embryos over there and we'd moved interstate. So we had no people. We were selling a house on the list of like really stressful kind of things. We were ticking most of the boxes. And so I just thought it was normal. And then it just kept on continuing for years afterwards. I just didn't know how to be around people anymore. And so it took years for me to work out that something else, I knew something else was there. And I'd speak to my counselor and I go, I feel autistic. Like I'd actually said that to them. And then after a while, just I went via PTSD. I was really angry. You were kind of saying, what's wrong with me? And I was like, what's wrong with everybody else? So I was really angry. And so I kind of learned to mask again in a work setting because I had to pay for IVF. And we continued doing that. But once we ceased doing that, so we had another miscarriage at 12 weeks, 1 year after our baby was born. And then we just kind of had successive failures after that. So I did 11 cycles, 6 stimulated and 5 frozen defrost cycles. And so you just like doing that. And so 10 years of my life was really focused on this thing. That means I'm already different to other people who have just had children and just been, looking after kids. So afterwards, it was just like learning to be around people again was really hard. And eventually I realized that there was something else there that was making my heart, I was getting heart palpitations. I got POTS, like you've spoken about, and also just lots of physical things that seemed a little bit disproportionate almost, even though I don't think it really is. So then I looked at autism and the female phenotype. Finally, kind of the information came out about the female phenotype, and that kind of really resonated with me.
I don't want to turn the attention to my own story at all. So
no, please do.
It makes sense. Okay.
Just do it. It makes sense.
Yeah, it was interesting because you were sharing more of your story when we were emailing back and forth. And I remember reading about the IVF experiences, and it was hard for me. I think it took a while to get back to you because for me, that's a particularly triggering topic. So to share a little bit of my story, if it helps at all. So after I had my first treatment for cancer, which was major surgery, so it was radical hysterectomy, I was informed that my margins were not clear enough. So I would have to have chemo and radiation as well. So because we weren't thinking that I needed to have radiation, they didn't move my ovaries out of the way. So usually they would, so that they wouldn't get so-called fried by radiation. So that meant I only had a small window of time when my when I would still have basically eggs available. So I wasn't like at that time, like I have a son from a previous relationship. So I was just kind of like, okay, but my partner, his wheels were apparently turning. My partner at the time, who's no longer my partner, he came to me one day, and I was, of course, at that point, I'd been in the hospital with sepsis after the surgery. So I was just like, my
wow.
body was just like
Oh,
over it, right? And
yeah.
I was hopped up on all kinds of meds and antibiotics. I was doing like blood thinner injections twice a day. And my partner
Oh.
was just like, yeah, so I think we should try to have a baby. And I was like, I can't do that, right? And he was
Yeah.
just like, well, I've been reading that we could, try to get the eggs. And I'm just like, well, I'm supposed to start radiation. Like, I think it was literally a couple weeks away at that point. And so I was like, if this is really important to you, I'll do it. But I was trusting him that he had my best interests in mind, and he was really thinking about our future, right? And at the time, looking back, and again, I was totally drugged out, but like I recall feeling that his emotions were odd. Like it felt a bit like a performance. And I know now that, he's potentially I'm not going to name names, but I believe there's some like narcissistic personality disorder going on or something like that. So it was really like a weird effect, just emotion wise. And I just remember thinking it gave me chills, like the whole, the whole conversation just kind of gave me chills. But I was like, still thinking of things from my own heart. And like, if this guy really wants kids and he wants kids with me, like, okay. And maybe he's just acting weird because this is all so much for him. And that was like the extent of my thought process. Really, I couldn't go very deep with it. And I was just like, okay, I guess let's talk to the doctors about it. And we went, and the doctor said, this is not normal, but we have been able to do this successfully with a surrogate. But you'll have to delay your cancer treatments, and that could put your life at risk. So I was like, okay, I think we're good with that. I guess we can do that. So that's my emotional
Why wasn't he
story.
Considering, okay, you're the priority at this point?
Yeah. I mean, that's what I would have loved to, like, looking back, obviously. But yeah, I wish I had chosen differently. I feel like I could have, and I put my own health and obviously life on the line to try to give this to him. And, the IVF itself was hard because physically, like, I was very swollen in that area, and I still had stitches, and the ovaries swell up to like that, like, and it was pushing on everything. So I was just in tremendous pain that whole time. So it was just like a month of just agony, even with the painkillers and stuff like that. So we ended up getting a few, like 7 or 8 eggs. And then they did ICSI, which is like they do the sperm injection right directly into the egg. And so we got 2 embryos from that, and ended up not doing anything with them, of course, because I ended up leaving him. So yeah. Anyway, that's my story. And I haven't shared it very often. I think like a few people know. So now I'm sharing it.
Yeah, amazing. It's awful. It's such a horrible thing to have gone through.
I know the physical effects of the medication IVF. So I mean, even that is a whole thing in itself. So yeah.
Yeah, because they make you feel worse, and you're in a situation where you're considering maybe you're going to die, or in my case, my baby had died, and then you're actually taking a drug, not an antidepressant, something that will make you feel worse and more stressed. Yeah. And it's really hard to explain to people that level of stress just kind of building and building, during a cycle.
Yeah, totally.
Like how it does, It's,
yeah. I'm so sorry that you went through that. That's just.
Yeah, thanks.
So, yeah, I mean, just thinking back, like, I know that must have been just like one thing after another. And I'm just so sorry that you had to go through that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. It's, and it's that crisis where, you're trying to understand it. And I was reading everything about grief at the time and going, it just seems like I'm in the complicated grief, or,
Mm-hmm.
it's going on forever, but I'm also kind of, you're simultaneously grieving a bunch of things,
Yeah.
like you were.
Mm-hmm.
And then also your relationship, which is just, another complicating factor that would have been awful. And in my case, it's kind of like this existential thing. I gave birth to a dead baby. So was she ever alive? Did I give birth? I did give birth and I am a mother, but people don't really perceive me as such. And so from then on, because I'm a bereaved parent of a baby who, died or was stillborn, I'm not really perceived in a normal way. So that's why for me, it's become very hard to mask, because there's always this situation quite regularly where people will say, do you have kids? And for me, it's like hugely triggering. Or when someone's having a baby, it's just like, no, those memories for me are not good. And so it's hard, because what I would normally do is mask, and I can do that. But in this case, it's very difficult because it's such a triggering and awful situation that I've been through, and the same for you. And that loss has really that's where I'm like, okay, well, this is why this other diagnosis is also useful for me, because I realize I have to find a different way around that. But being less around people is actually just one of the easiest things for me to do.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And I had some people, I don't know if this is the case for you, but after going through those things, and trying to figure out what the problem was, like some people suggested that it was depression. And I said, yeah, of course I'm depressed, but I've been depressed
Yeah.
before. And this has
Yeah.
not happened quite like this. Like I've experienced the numbing out, the sort of dead inside feeling, but this is something completely different. Like where all of my faculties are just like shut down and I don't have like a willful power over it at all.
Yeah. And it's really hard if your face stops emoting and you're dealing with other things. It's very hard to kind of work out, how do you do that now? Like you have to kind of relearn. It's like if someone's injured and they have to learn to walk again. You have to learn to do these things that you've learnt to do since you were a little kid, and now your body's just gone, oh, I'm not going to do that anymore. I had to learn to chew food properly. Like I kept on choking, and I ended up going to a specialist, and they said I had Schatzky rings, which is a physical stricture in your gut. And then after a while, when I started just being really careful with my eating again, it went. And then the next gastroenterologist said, no, you don't have that. So there were weird actual physical things that happened. And I had problems breathing, speaking, and also my blood pressure started to go up really badly when I was around people working. And so to the extent that doctors did like multiple tests on me, thyroid disease, all of those things. And then eventually I just went, oh, okay, well, I'm taking Inderal. And that I think ended up with like a paradoxical increase in my blood pressure. So I stopped taking that and just started being a bit more, I just had to take those steps to, self-care, and that really improved things. And being around people less for me is just easier. Physically, I don't get high blood pressure. There are actual physical ramifications for me where I can measure it, and then I can kind of alleviate it and change it and improve it, which I think, for kids who have the more severe autism, it's really hard for them to explain to people. They're suffering through. I feel a little bit, I feel such an empathy for kids who have those terrible versions of autism where they can't explain that to people, and where their carers can't, it's really hard for them to elicit that information. Where in our situation, we had physical symptoms. We could go, I'm experiencing this and this and this. What could it be? I can read about it and work out what it is and chat about it to a psychologist. I think it's useful for us to say these things, because this might be what someone with less ability to communicate it might be experiencing.
You said that you identified yourself with being autistic. So what was like the lead up to that? Did you find something online or a book that really stood out, and what was it?
I think there was just articles about females, and like I feel like I'm almost like an episodic, like it comes on in waves, and then I'll have periods of my life where it's like there's nothing wrong. I know that I'm a bit different or quirky, and a lot of people I think have like that, but then you have a crisis and it kind of brings it on. So it's like autism 1, I guess, kind of fits in for me. I found an article and I just kind of read it and went, oh, okay, yeah, I have that. But a lot of the things hadn't resonated for me previously, which is why I hadn't really thought about it. So a lot of the sensitivities I don't necessarily experience.
I know for me, I have something similar, and I think it's just, I would describe it as, times when I have a lot of ability to mask. And so the times when I don't have that same ability is, I guess, kind of marked by burnout, autistic burnout. So maybe that's kind of something similar.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how did you initially feel about your identification of your being autistic, and have your feelings changed at all?
I felt relieved to understand because as a child, I was more inclined to have one friend. I was really, really shy kid in preschool. We lived a year in England and I didn't mix with any child. I cried every single day because they played All Things Bright and Beautiful. And I had this sequence of songs that used to make me weep. And that was one of them. And mum was just like, can they just not play that song one day? But they played it every single day when we arrived. And so I would start weeping and then I would not stop crying. But no one went, oh, yeah, that's kind of a bit weird. Back then, it was just like, yeah, she'll get over it. And I didn't. I spent a whole year crying. And that was, I stopped crying for my photo. And my little cheeks are kind of tear streaked. But that's the only time I stopped crying in a year of playgroup. And so I was just a really, really shy kid. And so there were all these things, little things that kind of added up for me, which is why I really like you talking about the social model, because it's not necessarily a pathology. It's just something that just needs to be accommodated and empathized with or understood. I could have gone my life without really knowing or really kind of diagnosing myself, except that I had the crisis and stopped being able to do the masking that I was doing.
And how has your life changed for you after recognizing you're autistic? I know you mentioned some changes with work, but what was that process like? Are you an autistic person based in British Columbia, Canada? Small Army Entertainment, in collaboration with a leading Canadian broadcaster, is developing an exciting new series inspired by a global hit. The search is on for autistic individuals aged 18 or older based in British Columbia to join as interviewers. Imagine this. You'll receive training and then step into a studio to interview A-list celebrities, bringing a fresh and unique perspective to the conversation. You'll have the chance to ask insightful questions and explore the lives of famous personalities in ways that no one else has. If you're interested in the possibility of interviewing major celebrities and being part of an incredible team of autistic interviewers, Small Army Entertainment would love to hear from you. Reach out at production@smallarmyentertainment.com. That's production@smallarmyentertainment.com.
Quite liberating, really. Just knowing that I like time by myself. I like doing the things that I want to do. If I want to watch a program repeatedly, I will. And just enjoying the time with my dogs, getting out of the work that I was doing, which COVID actually enabled me to do because we had major lockdowns here. So my husband and I got out of our allied health job and just moved into other roles. And just knowing that, okay, that was, I did it. I went to uni and did all of those things and it was fine, but I just couldn't do it anymore. And I'd really hit burnout again. So it was liberating. I don't know that I wanted a diagnosis earlier though, because maybe I wouldn't have done the things that I've done and the travel. And I don't know where it's a useful thing. It would have been useful when I was doing IVF and it would have been useful after my baby died. But in my general life, I don't know when it would have been useful. And it's really hard to kind of tease it all apart when you're 50, when you get a diagnosis. What's your family upbringing and what's your condition? Because my family is kind of unusual anyway.
Has your self-concept changed at all?
Yeah, I think I kind of look at it and just think, okay, well, there are things about me. I'm quite blunt. My tendency after our baby died was anger. I don't know where that fits in. Have you heard of that in autism much? I don't know whether that's just my family or what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I've had times when I've had, I would say, rage. And
I love the way you say rage there, so gently and
just
delicately.
Just a little bit of rage.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's just, when a bunch of emotions just kind of build up, and then that's the most accessible one for me sometimes when it's like a muddle like that.
Yeah.
So I've definitely experienced that, or kind of oscillating,
awesome.
like rage, sadness, rage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know whether you speak about having cancer to people that you meet very often. I guess it's a subject that you can kind of avoid, but with children, it just comes up. And so I had to kind of go through getting over people's responses to that, because people don't mask like people who are autistic. And you can have really awful experiences when people ask whether you have children and your answer isn't the right answer. Or if someone says, oh, such and such is pregnant, and your answer isn't the right answer, and you don't have the facility to mask at that point, you'll seem, it's just like you're not acceptable to society if you're not a parent at the moment of a living child. And so I had to kind of learn to mask to deal with that, or be prepared for it. That, you can just be out at dinner, or I really don't like meeting new people now because I have to deal with that quite regularly. I want to meet new people, but it's sometimes when you get asked that question and someone's answer is a good one, you'll really like them, and that's really exciting. But that's not the most common experience that I've had.
What are some of the better responses, or what response kind of helps you feel better in that moment?
Even if people say, oh my gosh, I don't know what to say. Like if they say, look, I'm at a loss. But a lot of people will go, oh, I guess you're living the dreams now, no children. It's just like, yeah, that one's a good one. Or, oh, you can have mine. I really hate that one. I've had people just walk away from me and go, that's horrible, and just walk away. There's many responses, but the good ones are, one person said, you can have mine. And they actually meant it. And they made us like the guardians of their children. And that was lovely, because we became really good friends with him, because he went, you can have mine. And I went, look, I just really don't have a sense of humor about it. I'm really sorry. And he said it again. And I was like, look, I really don't have a sense of humor about this. I'm so sorry. And I was trying to be, calm. And then it turns out they were lovely and we became really good friends. That was a funny one, because it was, I wasn't anticipating. But I've also met friends who have, had tragedies in their own life. So you can kind of talk to them about it on a different level, where they've lost children, or, people who have experienced grief in a really severe and an early out of order loss, because that's, your baby dying is out of order loss. People who have experienced that are more likely to kind of have some sort of concept, because if your child dies or your partner dies, particularly, someone's young and they have a partner death, they've had that kind of early loss where all of a sudden you're isolated, you're different to everybody else. So, a lot of people will have their parents die, and that's awful for them in a lot of cases, but it's different to out of order loss. Yeah, and it's like you experiencing concern about your, potentially dying, which would be awful, really young. So it's a kind of a similar thing but just more on a kind of existential level for you.
Yeah, I have that definite experience of trying to explain myself and no one really getting it. And the only ones who really get it are people who've lived through a similar, medical trauma, basically in midlife. So I definitely identify.
Did you do a group or anything?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, actually, because the only group I was involved with was a research project or study that was going on that I enrolled in, that my doctors asked me if I was interested in. So it was like an online support group. And that actually was helpful. And it also showed me how I was experiencing things differently to other people, and perseverating on certain symptoms I was having, and the existential part of I could die, and how, because of my, I guess, autistic brain and the propensity of analyzing everything, I would just kind of churn these over and over. But also, I mean, I did have the option of support groups at the BC Cancers where I went for treatment. But I remember wanting to just physically leave as soon as I could. And other people would just stay around and go to counseling after. And I was just like, can't, even during follow-up, I would have to go back every 3 months for a checkup, and it was physical and it hurt. It was very invasive physical checkup. And then they would have this iPad that they would give me. And it would be all these questions on psychological questions are you experiencing this? They're checking obviously for PTSD, anxiety, depression. And I would lie because I knew if I tell the truth on this thing, they will keep me later. And I just want to get out, because I'm physically ill. I'm feeling nauseous, because this is where I had my radiation, my surgery, my chemo, this, I just want to leave. So I don't know how they could have changed that to accommodate an autistic brain. So
have it off campus.
Yeah. Or something maybe have questions that kind of trick me. I don't know. Because I played that one. But so that was my experience with that. In terms of telling people, like family members about being autistic or friends, like have you at all?
Only my partner and a couple of friends. I wouldn't tell my family. I feel like it could be used as a weapon against me. There's a bit of scapegoating and all sorts of unusual behavior that I wouldn't find that helpful. I left and moved kind of interstate when I was 22. So I really haven't been, I see them, but I haven't really had a support kind of network from my family really in that way that other people have around them. So no, I wouldn't tell them. They're just not interested in psychology. It's a lack of interest, a lack of insight into their own kind of issues as well. So it's not really something I discuss. But the friends that I've told have kind of gone, yeah, I guess so. Maybe, oh, you're too normal, or oh yeah, because they don't really know, they haven't really read the articles or the books or anything that kind of like makes sense to me. I don't know. I haven't really talked to many people about it. I don't really see a huge benefit now because they already know me for all of these years. It doesn't really change who I am. It just means I understand, okay, this is why I was really awful. And one of my friends, I was really awful to after my baby died. And she was so incredibly empathetic and kind and lovely, even though I was angry with her. She was great. And so she's kind of been through all of that and been really generous. And so it doesn't really make any difference, but she kind of gets it. But she was already an accommodating, nice person because she just go, she's just being, awful because of this event. I think they already know that I'm, have different behaviors anyway.
And looking back at I don't want to talk about it if it's triggering at all, but just out of curiosity, can you see a lot of neurodivergent traits in your family?
Yeah, well, there's just a lot of non kind of community, kind of part of a community, but not really into it. So not participators, so they kind of want family to be together, but then I believe there's a bit of kind of narcissism or those traits anyway. And also kind of some weird, it's hard because my parents were kind of brought up in the war. So there's, family who had been to war and then they come back. And I think my grandmother was a bit strange too. She used to try and scare my siblings when she was babysitting them and say, oh yeah, once the babysitter put the children in the microwave and killed them all. This is what she'd say when she was babysitting them. This is my father's mother. And then my dad was kind of, I think at heart, a nice person, but also was not present for me in any way. So I don't really think that I had a father who, was there and also physically absent from when I was about 9. I went from a family of 6 people to just me and my mum living in a small town where we had no family support. And, she was busy teaching. So it's very kind of isolated for a very long time there. And I thought that was the thing that made me less inclined to be around people. But I think also some of the things that I was seeing at home were, there was lots of arguments, there was alcohol, and there was not that kind of, I just wasn't read to, like there weren't those warm things that, a kid who maybe is neurodivergent needs to have some accommodations. And I kind of had the opposite of that. So I can see those behaviors and they weren't necessarily, they loved me, but it was an unusual, there were unusual ways of showing it.
Advocacy groups are making a difference, not just for individual patients and families. They are also shaping the healthcare landscape for all of us. But who are these people fighting for patients' rights? What strategies lead to success? And what pitfalls should be avoided? Welcome to Patient Advocacy Voices. I'm your host, Eric Racine. Join me on a journey to uncover the hidden stories of these remarkable champions for patients. If you're passionate about advocating for patients and want to accelerate your own efforts for the patients you serve, subscribe now to Patient Advocacy Voices.
I remember because a lot of autistic folks seem to have, they come from families where there's lots of dysfunction. Not all of them, but definitely it seems like more than neurotypicals, I would say. And I'm not sure exactly why that is. There's probably, history of undiagnosed autism, ADHD, various things. So that could be part of it and different, poor coping mechanisms that come up and lead to, parenting issues and things like that. And I remember for the longest time, I thought these things I'm identifying in myself as different than everyone else could be just trauma, PTSD. But then I would meet all these other folks who had even more trauma than myself, I would say. And they didn't have sensory issues. They didn't have the same issues with being burnt out or socializing or things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. You can kind of go, okay, there are people who had, significant major trauma, like, abuse, physical or sexual. And I had kind of emotional abuse that was, like my father used to come and stand in my room when he was really drunk and just kind of menace me. And it was a really weird thing to do to an 11-year-old kid. And I'd scream at him to get out. He never did anything. I was, aggressive in my own way to try and get him out, which might be one of the reasons why I'm more inclined towards that kind of anger. My mum wouldn't come in and say, what are you doing? And this happened repeatedly when he was drunk. We had those things, but it wasn't like I was being beaten up. And I, feel sorry for those people who have dealt with those, those type of traumas when they're a kid. But emotional abuse and that weird family setup, it makes it really hard to make decisions later in life because you're being taught how to behave in your home setting. And I was taught that being an academic meant that you were superior. I was just taught some really strange ways of dealing with people, and also that conversation is a competition. So I wasn't taught to converse, okay, you speak, I speak. Our family was speak over one another. And that was something I had to learn when I left home with some very patient friends.
I know you mentioned some traits that you had, like sensitivity and being shy and things like that, but what are some other traits that you had as a child that you know now to be related to autism?
I remember masking when I was really little. So I have 3 older siblings and they're, quite a bit older than me. And I remember, when they're fooling around, I would laugh, even though I didn't really understand what was going on. I remember one of my brothers, because they used to tease me a lot. They were nice in lots of ways and then they were teasing in lots of ways. One of my brothers would say to me, oh, that's a fake laugh. That's a fake laugh. And so then I'd laugh and I stopped knowing what my own laugh was when I was a 5-year-old. And I'd laugh and then he'd just say it was a fake laugh anyway. And that really kind of messed with me. So I remember kind of being aware that I like having these kind of little dilemmas and going, who am I? How do I laugh? How do I do things really early? And having to kind of fake it in a school setting when I then was around lots of, little girls who played in a different way because I was at home, arranging, stones in lines and lollies in lines or in colours and my dolls would be arranged in order. But I wouldn't do those imaginative play games that little girls did. And when I'd get to their houses and go, what are you doing? I wouldn't really kind of understand it. But I had a really, strong imagination and did imagine things in my own mind. They were just different things. So I was, very much into the Beatles and very much into watching, British comedy. And there was just kind of lots of things, but I was really intensely into. I had food, things where I'd just eat the same thing for 5 years or.
I guess that could be considered a sensory thing because of the reason behind it. Like, yeah.
Oh, I did have a sensory thing with my feet. When you're a kid and you jump off, you're sitting on something or you're sitting up high and you jump down onto the ground. That used to be excruciatingly painful for me. Did you ever remember that?
I had something where I still can't put like my bare feet flat on the ground. Like I don't like that feeling. So I kind of walk on the edges of my feet if I have no socks or shoes on.
Really?
Yeah. Still, it's very odd to see.
Great. I love it. What do you do at the beach?
Well, I wear flip-flops. I can actually like walk like that, but I don't like it. So like if I'm not conscious, I'll start doing that. I'm like, oh crap, I'm doing it in public. Cause like, it's,
oh, that's awesome.
But around the house, I'm just, yeah.
I did used to hate walking. Like I just felt like my feet were too bony or something. Like, and I felt them really, they're just, I have quite skinny feet anyway. They didn't feel good. And loud noises. I don't like loud electrical noises. But one of my brothers, there's this symphony called the Surprise Symphony, which has this big bang in it. And one of my brothers used to set it up on our stereo on full volume so that when I came into the lounge room, he'd turn it on. And so it'd be this kind of boom. And like for years, I would open the door and push it with my foot, with my hand over my ears.
with all of those sensitivities and differences, I guess, what was school like for you?
School was okay. I was kind of a good girl. I didn't really understand people getting in trouble. It was just like when kids, misbehaved, I just didn't really get it. I was just like, well, we don't have any power. Like, why would you try and get in trouble? And it really upset me to get into trouble. But I was just quite good, but a bit kind of self-righteous and black and white. And so I'd be more inclined to kind of argue. And I had kind of very specific things that I liked. And I liked having, a one friend, not necessarily a group of friends. There were periods where everybody left my home, like everyone went to uni. That year, I think I had pretty much a, like some sort of meltdown and didn't go to school pretty much for the whole of year 5. I didn't go in because I just couldn't be around people and I just fake illness. So I pretty well like missed a year. And then I started to feel a bit better and I met some really nice girls. And then high school was okay. And I wasn't bullied. I think I was kind of too aggressive to get bullied. So I would, if some kid, acted in that way, I was used to dealing with that in my home setting. I didn't have to deal with that in a school setting. And we had a pretty nice little school in reality. It was fairly friendly.
I'm starting to think that like I've spoken to quite a few people now for the podcast and then just chatting with people in the community who are autistic. And there's quite a few late diagnosed females specifically who they've felt different their whole lives. They're kind of struggling through school in some ways, but then they never got bullied because one of the things that we read about is like, if you're autistic, you get bullied. That's like almost all the time. But I don't remember. I think there was one period where I was briefly, and then I moved to Canada. So it kind of saved me. But I don't know. It's just because I think as females, being quiet and not saying much is kind of in line with femininity in some ways.
Oh, but I wasn't like that. I was like really, really loud.
So that protected you in a different way, I guess.
Yeah. And it was kind of like a mask. I was being taught at home that, I was kind of being scapegoated at the same time as being told, oh, we're really smart. We know what's right. And without actually ever reading anything or knowing anything, just like, yeah, I know what's right. You have this kind of self-righteousness when you think something, you have this kind of huge surge of adrenaline. And so I was like a debater, but it was not healthy because it was like, well, I should be being taught how to have a conversation, how to interact with people in a healthy manner where you don't need to be aggressive to actually, that was my mask, I guess. I was being taught that was the way to be with people. And I remember like having like in year 4, the other time I remember kind of being aware of masking, my dad kind of used to look a bit like Donald Trump in his angry ways. Like, how he has that kind of, that expression. And I used to do that in year 4 because I thought, oh, yeah, I'll look like I know what I'm doing. Or it was just a kind of conscious decision. And then later going, that's a pretty ugly look. Yeah, so I wasn't quiet. I was kind of the opposite, but not realizing that that's not really the way you are in society. So it's that societal view of the social model rather than the medical model at that point. I think, you're kind of naive. You don't really know, there's a reason why people listen to other people.
What types of supports do you wish you had growing up?
I wish I'd been read to. I wish someone had just sat down and been able to calm me down with things that were child friendly. I wasn't taken to like children's movies after the age of 8. I was taken to adult stuff. Everyone was older. And the 70s was a bit like that anyway. We just kind of got given a whole bunch of adult information and programming and books. And I think it just would have been really nice to have a bit more time where I was just allowed to be a kid and really kind of cosseted to some degree, but I wasn't. There was just like stuff where our house was kind of open and my dad didn't kind of make it so that it was child friendly. So it was like only warm in one room and it was quite cold where I grew up. We didn't have screens on the window and we had like spiders all the time. And I'm terrified of spiders. If we just had screens on the door or screens on the windows, then we wouldn't have been bitten by mosquitoes. But my dad's kind of a bit, he doesn't get eaten. He actually doesn't get mosquito bites. So he didn't bother looking after us so that we didn't get them. Yeah, there's just lots of little kind of nice things that I think maybe I would have liked. But as a 4th child, it happens, in lots of families that, everyone's busy, everyone's doing something. They don't have time for you.
And I know we've spoken about a lot of the sort of more negative side, I guess, or challenging side of being autistic. But what are your top 3 autistic traits that you love the most?
I love how much enjoyment I got out of music and have always got out of music. But as a 5-year-old, we bought the Beatles collection and I used to just sit and listen to it over and over. And it was amazing. Like it was just incredible. I just loved music. It really set things off in my mind and I could kind of escape into this imaginary world. I really enjoy music.
Is that something you go to today still?
I always have music on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Same.
Yeah. I kind of good. And you like lots of bands as well. So you go to lots of
it's so varied. Yeah, I have Spotify on all the time and at the end of the year they give you that like list of things like genres you've listened to and your top songs and it's always like wow, like you listen to all the genres, So
That's awesome.
yeah, but I love having music on and then, like my headphones are always like the batteries are running out. So I always have to like recharge, so yeah, but I find it very regulating.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I like that I've kind of been able to work out the things that do regulate me. And also I really enjoy a fascination with kind of reading articles and reading science. And I really like that there's this kind of movement of autistic people to create their own understanding of autism, like yourself, like, it's awesome what you're doing. I like that I'm kind of interested. And when I get onto a topic, I get really involved in it. Or when I get into a book, like I read War and Peace the other year, and I was just like, I'm living it when I'm reading it. I'm not just reading it. Yeah, which is kind of, sometimes my effusion is, a little bit much for other people because, I get really, really into it. But I like that. It's a great feeling when you get that engagement.
It's kind of like a blissful feeling.
It is. And I think that's where, with kids who have autism, it's lovely if families can kind of find, okay, what's the thing that regulates? It might be different to other kids, but that's okay.
You sent me an email and on is it vagal? I'd love for you to speak about that.
I heard this podcast. It was a Dr. Drew and Stephen Porges podcast, and it was years ago. This was kind of on my meanderings to try and find what I felt was the ultimate kind of issue with me. And so they talked about basically autonomic functioning, because at this point I got that, like, I had this feeling in my solar plexus that was really black, and that's where the vagal plexus is or something. And so I am not a biologist, and this is my understanding of the way they explained it. But a lot of the time when they talk about, fear-based reactions, they say it's fight, flight, and that's the sympathetic response. But it's kind of the way Stephen Porges talks about it, it's like a hierarchy. And so you go through a few different steps before you hit that fight, flight where your cortisol is pumping. And I was really noticing that I felt like I was just in that kind of initial phase all the time. Not necessarily, I had phases where I had the cortisol and I was just like, insane with it, with the stress while I was doing IVF. And then later it was just like, I'd feel my heart just kind of flick a little bit too quickly if I met someone who'd made me feel uncomfortable or if I was in a situation where I didn't feel safe. And so the way they talk about it, it's basically you have your normal regulation where your parasympathetic is operating and you're kind of in your flow state. But the first thing that happens in this theory is that the vagal brake flips, and that's your heart where you kind of go, oh, okay, wait a second, should I notice this? Should I be fearful? And that's a parasympathetic function, not sympathetic. So then you get to your sympathetic functioning if, okay, yep, there is a bear, I'm going to have to run. And then that kind of kicks in properly. But that lasts for a while. Like you don't just kind of suddenly run away from a bear and go, okay, I'm okay. Where if you hit the parasympathetic and you can kind of go, oh, no, it's okay. It was just a tree. I didn't recognize it. Then you can kind of calm down more quickly. And then if you are really scared and you get really, really scared, so like lizards will just kind of drop dead, that's where your parasympathetic actually kills you. Or I think you lose like bowel function and all of those things on the way. So it's like this levels, but understanding those levels and understanding that autonomic regulation was really important. So getting into a situation where you can digest your food easily and do all the things that you need to do for healthy autonomic functioning and regulation is really important to try and calm yourself. So for me, that really helped hearing that, because they talked about, how they get people with PTSD and none of these things are working. But it's not necessarily just that fight-flight response. It's not kind of a binary setting. It's something where there's kind of subtle things that happen along the way where you can notice it and go, oh, okay, I'm not regulating. So what they found phylogenetically was the different paths of the vagus. There's like these two paths. There's the old path and there's the newer path. Yeah, it's worth reading about. It's worth listening to that podcast to understand it more fully. But it just meant that there's this kind of historic usefulness of certain fear levels. And now we've evolved to have these other ones, but these old ones are still there and they can have an impact on you. So understanding those levels of fear for me were actually really useful in trying to lower my blood pressure.
I think a lot of autistic people, especially late diagnosed or late identified, is that, we don't really recognize that those sorts of physical or physiological responses, they're not normal and they're not good for us. And we don't realize that other people don't necessarily have those things going on. So it's really, like you said, it's really good to be aware of it because we need to take clear steps to reduce that and make sure we're not in that state all the time.
Absolutely. And I think the Fern Brady book that I mentioned to you that I read, which I loved, she's on Taskmaster. She's hilarious. She's a comedian, but she's written a really, really good book. And she talks about alexithymia, where you don't recognize physical symptoms. And so I had panic attacks for 30 years. And I didn't really recognize them as a panic attack because I didn't feel like I was dying and I didn't drop, like Tony Soprano did. I wouldn't get to that, but I wouldn't be able to breathe properly and I wouldn't be able to speak properly and I wouldn't be able to swallow properly. So I'd have these things where I'd have this major physical sensations without being able to put the two together. And I'd go to doctors and they go, "Are you stressed?" And I go, "Yeah." But we would never kind of go, "Oh, okay, well, this might be a panic attack." When I realized that, it was just like, oh, okay, that was kind of where it was really helpful for me to find this diagnosis or identification. It just kind of made it all make sense. And it made me realize that as soon as I started working full time, I had those symptoms. So as a 23-year-old, and it took me 30 years to go, oh, right, it's not me. It's not my fault,
Mm-hmm. Right. What is a myth or stereotype about autism or autistic people that bothers you the most?
I hate the vaccine one because that's had such terrible consequences. I also am annoyed, I'm kind of curious where the diagnosis of autism is going to kind of change in the future because it's a very big area for one word to be ascribed to it. And I feel to some extent that it's a slap in the face to the people who have like really severe symptoms and, high support needs and their family, like that they have to experience and that their family has to, support. It doesn't seem kind of fair to be kind of almost saying, "Oh, yeah, I've got the same thing," even though I've been able to, look after myself. It's just like I want there to be a diagnosis that everybody's happy with. And I want it to be, genetically tested and biologically tested. I don't want it to just be, "Oh, I've got this thing, I can explain it." But I'd love for it to have, "Oh, yeah, I did the blood test and I have this. And so it's going to lead to these physical symptoms in me." So the myth that it is this thing where it's actually fairly arbitrary. Have you read the book of Woe?
No, I haven't.
It's the book about the DSM and the history of it. Yeah, you should read that.
Yeah.
People who had the Asperger's diagnosis, even though that has negative links, why they were upset. It's just like, well, we're this thing and now you've gone, "Oh, we're this other thing," but it's all fairly arbitrary. Do you have any issues with that?
The science part of me doesn't like that it's so based on a questionnaire or something like that. It would be, and it bothers me that I could go to a different practitioner and be told no, that it takes specialized knowledge of, female autism phenotype. And that bothers me a bit. At the same time, I know that there are people doing research to, figure out the genes behind the different presentations. And that's probably going to take a while because there's so many different presentations of autism. It worries me only because I feel like people might use that to be like, well, now we know this gene, we can probably cure it, or just give you some, like CRISPR Cas9 and we'll just kind of zap it out of you kind of thing. Or people testing, they do the pregnancy screening, they do for Down syndrome, and I can see it being used, for autism as well. And so knowing like the strengths that autism brings to society as a whole, and like a lot of the people who have discovered really cool things, a lot of scientists, a lot of artists are autistic. It's like, well, you'd be kind of, taking something very valuable out of the world if you were going to use it that way. So that worries me.
Yeah, yeah. And I loved, when you were talking about the evolutionary aspect, you have to wonder who was the first person who made friends with a wolf, you know, the person who didn't want to be with the group, the one who kind of loves animals. Because there does seem to be a very strong tendency towards friendships with animals, in autism. Like it just seems to kind of go hand in hand.
When you were speaking about the evolutionary thing, I remember reading they compared, the early cave paintings where, they're very overlapped with the horses and the different animals, like kind of very closely overlapped, almost like it's one line connecting all of them. And they've compared it to very young autistic, like prodigies, savants, and how the artistry is very similar. So they like some people think, with good reason that the first painters, the artists were autistic or otherwise
Wow.
neurodivergent. So I can see that as well.
Yeah.
Do you have a message for adults just starting out on their autism discovery journey? I know you don't like the word journey, so we can remove that too.
Yeah. Just don't put it on the bit about IVF, and I just hate that word so much. I hate the word healing too. Just they're kind of their buzzwords, and they just kind of it's okay if you have a minor issue, but for major issues, it's just like, yeah, I'm probably just going to have to assimilate this. I won't, ever heal from it. It wasn't a journey. I'm just going to assimilate. I'm going to get used to it, and other people will have to kind of accommodate it. Basically, I just say, look, do things that work for you. If you mask, just start noticing when you do it. But, you might feel that you have to continue doing it because of the type of work that you do, but just be aware it's using up your emotions and it's using up your energy. And then later on, you might have a meltdown. You have to kind of start to just be aware, okay, what are the things that are going to set me off and maybe lead to some sort of a meltdown? And anything that's using up that energy, if you have to do a work where you have to deal with people, make sure you have a rest later on, give yourself time and give yourself space to take and do the things that regulate you, which might be different to other people's. I love that woman that you spoke to who has all of the snakes and the lizards at home and all the things that she loves. She's just so beautiful to listen to. And then I was just like, oh my God, you have spiders? It freaked me out, but it's great because she's found the things that really work for her. And she has this house where, she's got all these animals that she loves. But that's great. She's found the things that kind of work for her. And I think that's what anyone who's looking at this diagnosis just go, okay, well, society tells me that I must do this, but society isn't always correct. And you can just do the things you need to do. As long as it doesn't hurt anyone or any animals, then, do what you need to do.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you about that you'd like to discuss? I feel like we could just keep talking, but
I know. This has been great. It's been so lovely chatting with you.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you wanted to say about your history? Because it's really amazing what you've dealt with.
I guess I could probably add things. Like I feel like too that more things will come up, and some things I feel like I've kind of blocked. And, the podcast has been interesting because it's kind of drawn out parts of my own story that I wasn't feeling like I was ready to talk about. And then I did in the moment and it was good. So, yeah. But one thing that you mentioned that you've been in this lovely relationship for 16 years. So one question that came up is your partner, what sorts of things does he do that help you?
He really likes doing things in our home environment. And, he loves walking with our beagle and he loves music. And we connected so much over music and programs and being able to talk about just lots of things that we were really connected on and like really, really kind of esoteric things. And we love reading and he likes to kind of find new stuff all the time. So it's very kind of stimulating because he's always, reading something new or listening to something new. My sympathies go out to everyone who had a terrible period during COVID. We loved lockdown. And we just kind of, every time there was like a lockdown coming up, we were like, come on. We loved it. And we have one of the longest lockdowns in the world, apart from the awful ones in China. Yeah, we changed jobs. We just spent time at home and that was never a problem. We didn't get bored with that. There's so many things we can do in our home. We like to go out and be with people, a small kind of circle of friends rather than a massive one. But he's just really generous in understanding, where I have kind of had to go through this process. He's been really generous with kind of understanding me and also telling me when I wasn't okay, going through all that grief together. you'll eventually kind of be dealing with grief differently. And also he had to deal with a different scenario than I do as a female. So, and we know that, I'm more likely to be asked regularly, or it's assumed that I have children alive. And so he's aware and kind of really empathetic about that. He understands that, mine is kind of more continuing because people don't really ask men as much. Yeah, he's just a wonderful person. He's really lovely. And I was really lucky, to meet him. But we've had some really difficult things to have to go through. So, if I was going to go through it with anyone, it would be him. Yeah, I had a fall. I didn't mention this because it's just like there were too many things. Just the year before I started doing IVF, just after I'd met my current partner, we were in a shop and they had like a trapdoor open and I fell down a whole floor.
Oh, no. Oh, wow.
I know. But here's the weird thing, right? I'm kind of curious whether this is an autistic thing, because when I fell, because I always have this thing where I laugh when people injure themselves. But when it happened to me, I was hysterical. I couldn't stop laughing, even though I'd broken my wrist, hurt my elbow. And I'd hit my head. Unfortunately, I'd landed on a ladder and I just kind of waxed, all these different levels of myself. Mm-hmm. And I never got any compensation or anything. It was awful. And so I chipped my hip. And so I've had to have hip surgery following that. But it was really weird at the time. My first response was hysterical laughter, because I was imagining myself going down this, like just kind of, like a cartoon character, mm-hmm. kind of, because I actually almost like stepped across, was in like air for a second. And apparently, my partner just kind of heard me go, oh. And then I fell down a whole floor. And so then I thought they were going to think I was insane, but we walked out. We should have called the ambulance and then we went to the hospital. But yeah, it was a weird response. It was very strange.
I could definitely relate. So it must be. Yeah. I feel like I laugh at times where I definitely should not be laughing. So yeah, I think it scares other people a little bit, but
I know. I've had to really tamp it down because it really irritated my partner. I was glad that at least I did it for me as well. It wasn't just other people injuring themselves.
Yeah. A huge thank you to Kat for being my guest on the Other Autism podcast. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for being here. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, I invite you to leave a rating or review and share this episode with a loved one. If you'd like to submit a question or message to listeners, please send an email. You can find the email address and more in the show notes.